So they are really fixated on the bread. The crowd just got fed miraculously with those 5 loaves and the 2 fish from last week. Everyone got enough. And in fact, there was so much left over that they could gather up the leftovers. And then they go looking for Jesus again, apparently because they want more bread. Very truly, I tell you, says Jesus, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. They're not looking for Jesus because they got the deeper meaning of the loaves and the fish. They're not looking for Jesus because they want something more. They're not looking for Jesus because they understood that the miraculous feeding was a sign pointing them to the eternal. No, they just want more bread. What sign are you going to do then? They ask. Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, they suggest, almost as if they're goading Jesus into action, like a schoolyard taunt. Moses gave our people manna. What are you going to do, Jesus? Show us what you can do, Jesus. They are really fixated on the bread rather than the bread, which, when you think about it, is completely understandable. They're hungry, they're most likely poor, they're far from home, they need food. Of course, they're fixated on their next meal. Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The psychologist Abraham Maslow described how we humans have to meet our basic needs first, shelter and food, before we can even begin to think about higher order needs like belonging and purpose. As Maslow wrote, freedom, love, community feeling, respect, philosophy may all be waved aside as fripperies that are useless since they fail to fill the stomach. We also now know from research that when people are hungry or living in poverty, that their ability to learn and make decisions is actually impaired because so much mental energy goes into just surviving. So can we blame the crowd? Can we blame them for wanting more bread, for being worried about their next meal? And yet, Jesus is pointing them to a different bread, a spiritual food, a sustenance for the soul. He's trying to point them, in fact, to his very being, to the presence of God, what will ultimately sustain them. As Lutheran Bishop Craig Satterley writes, I don't think Jesus was scolding the crowd for seeking bread because they were hungry. I do think Jesus was disappointed that the crowd did not expect more, not more bread, but something more. But as Maslow would argue, sometimes that more is hard, if not impossible, to imagine. I think that's been one of the challenges of this pandemic. Ever since last March, 16 months ago, the very foundations upon which our lives are ordered have either been entirely disrupted or made uncertain. It has required an incredible amount of energy just to navigate the most basic aspects of our lives. How should we buy groceries? Where should we go and when? Is school going to happen? When? How? Should we go to the office? And what's safe to do when we get there? Do we eat inside restaurants or outside restaurants? And with who? Do we feel comfortable eating? Should we plan the vacation, plan the summer camp, plan the birthday party? Can we plan anything at all 3 or 6 months out from now? If my brother's wife tests positive 3 days after he visits me on a porch with 2 open sides, and we talk at a moderate volume for 97 minutes when the wind speed is about 7 miles per hour, do I need to quarantine? And if so, do I quarantine for 10 days or 14 days? See, these are the questions that we have to puzzle through. But then, good people, the vaccines came. And for a blissful few months, we were able to relax and even pretend that things were normal, despite the fact that the virus was still raging around the world and much of humanity has little to no access to vaccines. And now, of course, more change and uncertainty. Just how contagious is the Delta variant? Just how common are the breakthrough infections? When do I need to wear a mask now? How easy is it for me to pass the virus to unvaccinated children or vulnerable elders or those with medical conditions? How long are our vaccines going to last? How should we worship? And where and when and with whom? We're fixated on the bread. We've had to be focused on our day-to-day safety and the decisions around school, work, travel, church, socializing. And we've been exhausted by decisions. And so perhaps we have been fixated on bread at the expense of the bread of life. Perhaps we've been so mentally and emotionally tied up navigating the uncertainties of life that we haven't had the capacity to stop and ground ourselves in the one who gives life. I know that's been true for me. There have been many times during this pandemic when I have felt overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the threat, overwhelmed by concern for my parents' safety, by all the decisions to be made for our multi-household family, by all the school changes, by worry for all our West Parish folks, by all the decisions about how to worship and how to gather, by the differences of opinion to manage, by the grief and loss and anger and fear. It's been overwhelming and exhausting. And so just at the very moment when I might have turned to God for sustenance, when I might have sought the bread of life, instead, often I didn't have the capacity to see much further than my own empty plate. I was caught up in my immediate worries and decisions. I, like the crowd, was fixated on the bread. Things will remain uncertain. That uncertainty may cause us to narrow our focus and fixate on bread. It may cause us to expend a lot of energy making decisions or calculating risk. It may cause us to become exhausted. But that other bread, the true bread from heaven, is available to us always. There is more, even when we forget to look up from our plates. And that, my friends, is why we gather. We gather to remind one another to seek the bread of life. Even though it cannot fully be explained, even Jesus had to use metaphors. But we trust that it is here, that's available to us, that God's presence remains with us through every situation. So when we find that in the midst of uncertainty and fear, our gaze starts to constrict, we have our church, we have one another to remind us to lift our eyes up and recognize that the bread of life is right here, and there is enough for all of us. Amen.